The morning sun cast long shadows across the Coronado Beach training grounds as Lieutenant Sarah Chun adjusted her worn baseball cap and checked her watch. She had arrived early for the joint training exercise, preferring the quiet moments before chaos erupted. The Pacific waves crashed rhythmically against the shore, a sound she had grown to love during her years stationed here. Few people knew that this petite woman with a gentle smile had spent the last 8 years as one of the Navy's most decorated intelligence officers, or that she held certifications in advanced combat tactics that most people only read about in novels. Sarah walked toward the equipment staging area where various military units were preparing for the day's exercises. She moved with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in her own skin, her presence neither demanding attention nor avoiding it. Her tactical vest hung loose over civilian clothes, and her gear bag looked like it had seen better days. To the casual observer, she appeared to be just another support staff member or perhaps a civilian contractor helping with logistics. The joint training exercise was designed to test inter-unit cooperation between Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and various support personnel. Sarah's role was officially listed as tactical advisor, though the full extent of her capabilities remained classified. She had requested this assignment specifically because she wanted to observe how different units worked together under pressure. Her real job involved analyzing enemy tactics and developing counter-strategies, work that required her to understand how elite soldiers thought and operated. As she approached the equipment tables, Sarah noticed a group of Navy SEALs conducting their morning briefing near a cluster of vehicles. Their instructor, a tall man with arms covered in intricate tattoos, was emphasizing the importance of maintaining unit cohesion during the upcoming scenario. The SEALs listened intently, their faces serious as they absorbed details about the mock mission they would be executing. Sarah began checking communication equipment, methodically testing each radio and earpiece to ensure clear frequencies. Her movements were precise and efficient, the result of years spent in situations where equipment failure could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She had learned these skills in places whose names were classified, during operations that would never appear in any public record. "Excuse me, miss," called a voice from behind her. Sarah turned to see one of the SEALs approaching, his stride confident, and his expression showing mild irritation. His name tape read Morrison, and his bearing suggested he was accustomed to being the most capable person in any room. "This is a restricted area for military personnel only. You'll need to move your stuff somewhere else." Sarah looked up from her equipment check, meeting Morrison's eyes with a calm expression. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she replied quietly, returning her attention to the radio in her hands. Her voice carried no defensiveness or challenge, simply stating a fact. Morrison's eyebrows rose at what he perceived as defiance from a civilian. He moved closer, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used with subordinates. "Look, sweetheart, I don't know who told you it was okay to play with military equipment, but this isn't a game. These radios are worth more than your car, and we need them functioning perfectly for today's operation." Several other SEALs had noticed the interaction and were now watching with varying degrees of interest. Sarah continued her equipment check, her movements unchanged by Morrison's presence. She tested another radio, noted its frequency response in her tablet, and moved to the next item on her list. Her calm demeanor seemed to frustrate Morrison further. "Are you even listening to me?" Morrison demanded, stepping directly into Sarah's line of sight. "I said this is a restricted area. Military personnel only. That means you need to pack up your little hobby project and find somewhere else to play." Sarah set down the radio she was holding and looked directly at Morrison. Her brown eyes were steady and unreadable, showing neither anger nor intimidation. "I heard you clearly the first time," she said, "and I told you I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The exchange had now drawn the attention of Morrison's entire squad. They formed a loose semicircle around the interaction, some smirking at what they assumed was a civilian stubbornness, others looking slightly uncomfortable with their teammates' aggressive approach. The morning air carried the scent of salt spray, and the distant sound of helicopters conducting their own training exercises. Morrison's face reddened slightly. In his world, when he gave an order, people followed it immediately and without question. This small woman's quiet defiance challenged everything he understood about authority and respect. "Listen, Cutie," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I don't know what fantasy you're living in, but this is the real world. Real military. Real operations. Stay in your lane before you get hurt or cause someone else to get hurt." The word "cutie" hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Several of the watching SEALs shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that their teammate had just crossed a line. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something subtle shifted in her posture. The change was so slight that most observers missed it, but those trained to read body language might have noticed that she had unconsciously moved into a more balanced stance. "My lane," Sarah repeated slowly, as if considering the phrase carefully. Interesting choice of words. She picked up her tablet and stylus, making another notation with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the encounter. "Tell me, what exactly do you think my lane is?" Morrison gestured dismissively at her equipment and civilian clothes. "Support staff. Logistics. Maybe communications tech, if someone's feeling generous. Definitely not field operations, and definitely not anywhere near classified equipment." He looked around at his teammates for support, expecting to see agreement in their faces. What Morrison didn't know was that Sarah had spent 3 years embedded with special operations teams in Afghanistan, providing real-time intelligence analysis that had saved countless lives. She had been shot twice, blown up once, and had personally extracted vital intelligence from situations that would have broken most people. Her civilian clothes and gentle demeanor were tools she used deliberately, allowing her to move through the world without drawing the kind of attention that could compromise her work. Sarah nodded thoughtfully at Morrison's assessment. "Support staff," she mused. "That's one way to look at it." She gestured toward the tactical equipment spread across the tables. "These radios, for example. Do you know their effective range in urban environments with significant electromagnetic interference?" Morrison's confidence wavered slightly. He knew the basic specs of the equipment, but had never been tested on technical details in a real-world scenario. "Of course I know the specs," he said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "What about frequency hopping patterns when operating in contested electromagnetic environments?" Sarah continued, her tone remaining conversational. "Or the backup protocols when primary encryption keys are compromised in the field?" The questions were specific enough that Morrison realized he was out of his depth, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. Instead, he doubled down on his original position. "Look, I don't need to play 20 questions with some contractor who read a manual. I need this equipment ready for real operations, not classroom discussions." Sarah smiled for the first time since the conversation began. It was a gentle expression that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of smile that suggested she knew something others didn't. "Real operations," she repeated. "Of course. You're absolutely right about that." She returned to her equipment check, but now her movements carried a different quality. Where before she had worked with quiet efficiency, now there was an unmistakable precision that spoke of extensive field experience. She handled each piece of equipment with the kind of familiarity that came from relying on it in life and death situations. Morrison watched her work for a moment, his irritation growing as he realized she was ignoring his authority. In his experience, civilians either argued back or complied immediately when faced with military authority. Sarah's calm persistence was something outside his understanding, and it made him increasingly uncomfortable. "You know what?" Morrison said, his voice rising slightly. "I've had enough of this. Thompson," he called to one of his teammates, "radio base, and find out who authorized civilian personnel to have access to our communications equipment. This is exactly the kind of security breach that gets people killed in real operations." Thompson, a younger SEAL who had been watching the exchange with growing unease, hesitated before responding. "Morrison, maybe we should just check with the briefing officer first. I mean, if she's supposed to be here." "She's not supposed to be here," Morrison snapped. That much is obvious. Real military personnel don't dress like they're going to a coffee shop, and they sure as hell don't ignore direct orders from Navy SEALs. Sarah continued her work, but several of the watching SEALs noticed that she had shifted to checking more sophisticated equipment. She was now examining encrypted satellite communication devices and advanced tactical computers, handling them with the kind of expertise that suggested extensive training and experience. Her familiarity with the equipment was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. "Ma'am," said Rodriguez, another SEAL who had been watching quietly, "maybe you could just show us your authorization? Just to clear things up." His tone was respectful, a marked contrast to Morrison's aggression. Sarah looked up from the tactical computer she was configuring. "My authorization," she said thoughtfully. "That's a reasonable request." She reached into her gear bag and pulled out a small leather folder, which she handed to Rodriguez without ceremony. Rodriguez opened the folder, and his expression immediately changed. His eyes widened as he read the contents, and his posture unconsciously straightened into a more formal stance. He looked from the documents to Sarah and back again, as if trying to reconcile what he was reading with what he was seeing. "What's it say?" Morrison demanded, reaching for the folder. Rodriguez handed it over reluctantly, his face now showing a mixture of embarrassment and concern. Morrison grabbed the documents and began reading, his confident expression gradually transforming into something approaching alarm. The folder contained Sarah's military identification, her security clearances, and her operational credentials. More importantly, it contained her actual rank and position within naval intelligence, information that made it clear she outranked everyone present by a significant margin. The documents also referenced commendations and operations that were classified above the level of most field personnel. Morrison's face went through several color changes as he processed what he was reading. Around him, the other SEALs were beginning to understand that they had just witnessed their teammate make a significant error in judgment. The morning's training exercise was taking on an entirely different character than anyone had expected. This can't be right," Morrison stammered, looking back and forth between the documents and Sarah's calm face. "You're telling me you're exactly where I'm supposed to be," Sarah finished for him, her voice maintaining the same quiet tone she had used throughout the encounter. "Just like I said from the beginning." The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, and Sarah glanced toward the horizon where 3 aircraft were becoming visible against the morning sky. She checked her watch and made another notation on her tablet, her expression suggesting this development was exactly what she had been expecting. "Those would be right on time," she murmured, more to herself than to the watching SEALs. Morrison was still staring at the credentials in his hands, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Around him, his teammates were beginning to understand the full scope of what had just occurred. The woman they had assumed was civilian support staff was not only military personnel, but held a rank and position that made her one of the most senior people present at the entire training exercise. The helicopters were growing larger now, their approach vector suggesting they were heading directly for the training area. Sarah packed away her equipment with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the morning, but now her actions carried the unmistakable authority of someone preparing to take operational control. "Gentlemen," she said, looking around at the assembled SEALs, "I believe your briefing is about to begin." The 3 helicopters descended toward the training area with military precision, their rotors creating expanding circles of sand and debris that forced everyone to step back and shield their eyes. Sarah stood her ground, her baseball cap pulled low as she watched the aircraft execute a perfect tactical landing formation. Morrison and his team found themselves unconsciously moving behind her, seeking shelter from the rotor wash while trying to process the rapidly changing situation. As the engines wound down and the dust settled, Sarah checked her communications equipment one final time before walking toward the lead helicopter. Her movement was purposeful and confident, the walk of someone who had done this countless times before in situations far more dangerous than a training exercise. The SEALs followed at a distance, their earlier bravado replaced by growing uncertainty about what they were witnessing. The side door of the lead helicopter slid open, and a figure in full combat gear stepped out. Even from a distance, it was clear this was someone of significant rank and authority. The figure approached Sarah directly, bypassing the SEALs entirely, and the two began what appeared to be a tactical briefing. Their conversation was too quiet for others to overhear, but their body language suggested a professional relationship built on mutual respect and extensive shared experience. Morrison watched this interaction with growing alarm. The credentials he still held in his hands had made it clear that Sarah was far more than she appeared. But seeing her take operational control of what he had assumed would be a routine training exercise was forcing him to confront the full scope of his mistake. Around him, his teammates were beginning to whisper among themselves, their earlier amusement replaced by concern about the potential consequences of Morrison's behavior. "Maybe we should apologize," Thompson suggested quietly, his eyes fixed on the interaction between Sarah and the helicopter crew. "I mean, if she really is who those papers say she is, apologize for what?" Morrison snapped, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I was doing my job. Security is security. How was I supposed to know she was undercover or whatever this is?" Rodriguez shook his head grimly. "She wasn't undercover, man. She was exactly who she said she was from the beginning. We just made assumptions." He gestured toward the helicopters and the growing activity around them. "And something tells me those assumptions are about to bite us in ways we haven't even thought of yet." The second and third helicopters had also disgorged their passengers, and the training area was now bustling with personnel who moved with the unmistakable efficiency of experienced operators. These were not the typical support staff that usually manage training exercises. Every individual carried themselves with the bearing of someone accustomed to high-stakes situations, and their equipment was clearly state-of-the-art. Sarah concluded her conversation with the lead officer and turned back toward the SEALs. As she approached, Morrison could see that her entire demeanor had shifted. Where before she had been accommodating and patient despite his rudeness, now she carried herself with the unmistakable authority of someone taking operational control. Her earlier gentleness hadn't disappeared, but it was now clearly revealed as the choice of someone confident enough in their own power to afford kindness. "Gentlemen," Sarah said as she rejoined the group, "there's been a change in today's exercise parameters." Her voice carried the crisp authority of a briefing officer, and several of the SEALs found themselves unconsciously straightening to attention. What was planned as a routine inter-unit cooperation drill has been upgraded to a full-scale tactical assessment. Morrison's stomach dropped as he began to understand the implications. A full-scale tactical assessment meant their performance would be evaluated not just for training purposes, but potentially for their permanent records. Worse, it suggested that senior leadership was taking a direct interest in their unit's capabilities and readiness. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said carefully, "what exactly does that mean for our team?" Sarah consulted the tablet she carried, scrolling through information with practiced efficiency. "It means you'll be operating under direct observation from Naval Special Warfare Command. Your tactical decisions, unit cohesion, and individual performance will be evaluated against current operational standards." She looked up from the tablet to meet their eyes. "In other words, everything you do today matters significantly more than you thought when you woke up this morning." The weight of this revelation settled over the group like a lead blanket. Training exercises were one thing, but being evaluated by senior command was an entirely different level of pressure. Careers could be made or broken based on performance during such assessments, and everyone present knew it. Thompson cleared his throat nervously. "Will you be conducting the evaluation, ma'am?" Sarah's expression remained neutral, but there was a hint of something in her eyes that might have been amusement. "I'll be one of several observers, yes. My role is to assess tactical decision-making under pressure and evaluate how well units adapt when their initial assumptions prove incorrect." She paused meaningfully before adding, "Speaking of incorrect assumptions, I should probably clarify something for you all. Morrison felt his mouth go dry. He had a terrible suspicion about what was coming next. The equipment I was checking this morning isn't just standard communications gear, Sarah continued. It's an integrated tactical network designed to provide real-time intelligence and coordination support during complex operations. The reason I needed to verify its functionality is because your unit will be relying on it for today's scenario. She gestured toward the sophisticated equipment she had been testing. Every radio, every computer, every piece of technology you'll be using today has been configured according to specifications I developed based on extensive field experience in contested environments. The frequency parameters, encryption protocols, and backup procedures I was verifying are all based on lessons learned during actual combat operations. The implication was clear. Not only was Sarah far more qualified than any of them had assumed, but their success in the day's exercise would depend entirely on systems she had designed and configured. Morrison's earlier dismissal of her work as playing with military equipment now seemed not just wrong, but professionally disastrous. Rodriguez, who seemed to be emerging as the group spokesman, spoke up again. "Ma'am, I think I speak for all of us when I say we may have made some initial misjudgments about the situation this morning." Sarah nodded acknowledgement of his diplomatic phrasing. "Initial impressions can be deceiving," she agreed. "That's actually one of the key skills we'll be evaluating today. How quickly can a unit recognize when their assumptions are wrong, and how effectively can they adapt their approach based on new information?" Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a croak. What kind of scenario are we looking at?" Sarah's expression became more serious as she shifted into full briefing mode. "You'll be operating in a simulated urban environment where the enemy forces have been deliberately designed to challenge your preconceptions. The opposing team includes personnel who don't fit standard enemy profiles, equipment that doesn't match traditional threat assessments, and tactical approaches that subvert conventional expectations." She pulled up a display on her tablet and showed them an overhead view of the training area. "Your mission objective appears straightforward. Locate and neutralize a high-value target who has been identified as coordinating enemy activities in the urban sector. However, the intelligence you've been given contains several deliberate inaccuracies designed to test your ability to adapt when reality doesn't match your briefing." The complexity of the scenario was becoming clear, and it was far more sophisticated than anything the SEALs had expected from a routine training exercise. This wasn't just about physical skills or tactical knowledge. It was about psychological flexibility and the ability to operate effectively when fundamental assumptions prove false. The evaluation criteria focus heavily on leadership under uncertainty, Sarah continued. How do team leaders respond when their initial plans become invalid? How effectively do they incorporate new information? How well do they manage team dynamics when stress levels increase due to unexpected developments? Morrison was beginning to understand that his behavior that morning hadn't just been rude. It had been a perfect demonstration of exactly the kind of inflexibility that the exercise was designed to identify and correct. His assumption that Sarah was unqualified civilian personnel, his refusal to consider alternative explanations for her presence, and his increasingly aggressive insistence on his own authority were textbook examples of the cognitive failures that could get people killed in real operations. "There's one more thing you should know," Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious. "The observers for this exercise include personnel who have extensive experience in actual combat operations. They're not just evaluating your tactical skills. They're assessing whether you have the psychological resilience and adaptive thinking necessary for real-world missions where the enemy doesn't follow the rulebook." The helicopters behind them were now fully operational, with crews setting up sophisticated monitoring equipment and communication arrays. The entire training area was being transformed into something that looked less like a routine exercise and more like an actual combat operations center. The level of technology and personnel involved made it clear that this evaluation carried weight far beyond anything the SEALs had initially understood. "How long have you been planning this?" Thompson asked, looking around at the rapidly evolving situation. Sarah checked her watch with the same precision she had shown throughout the morning. The assessment protocol was implemented 6 weeks ago, but the specific scenario was finalized last night based on preliminary observations of unit readiness. She looked directly at Morrison as she added, "Sometimes the most valuable intelligence comes from watching how people behave when they think no one important is paying attention." The full scope of the morning's events was finally becoming clear. Sarah's early arrival, her methodical equipment check, and even her calm response to Morrison's aggressive behavior had all been part of an evaluation that had begun the moment they arrived at the training area. Every assumption they had made, every decision they had taken, and every word they had spoken had been observed and assessed by someone whose qualifications to make such judgments were beyond question. Morrison looked down at the credentials still in his hands, seeing them now with completely different eyes. The woman he had dismissed as civilian support staff was not only a decorated intelligence officer, but someone whose expertise in adaptive tactical thinking was apparently significant enough to warrant deploying 3 helicopters and a full evaluation team to observe her work. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said carefully, "is there anything specific we should know about today's scenario that might help us to perform better?" Sarah's expression softened slightly, revealing a hint of the gentle patience she had shown earlier. "The best advice I can give you is to remember that effective leadership requires humility. The moment you assume you understand a situation completely is usually the moment that situation is about to change in ways you haven't anticipated." She gestured toward the sophisticated equipment and personnel now surrounding them. Real military operations are rarely as clean or predictable as training scenarios suggest. The enemy doesn't wear clearly marked uniforms. Civilian personnel often have capabilities that aren't immediately obvious, and the most dangerous threats frequently come from directions you weren't watching. The morning sun was now fully up, casting sharp shadows across the training area and highlighting the dramatic transformation that had taken place since the SEALs' arrival. What had begun as a routine exercise was revealing itself to be something far more significant, and everyone present was beginning to understand that their performance over the next several hours would have consequences extending far beyond the training grounds. Morrison finally handed the credentials back to Sarah, his earlier swagger completely gone. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions that were completely out of line, and I spoke to you in a way that was unprofessional and disrespectful." Sarah accepted the credentials and tucked them back in her gear bag. "Apology accepted," she said simply. "But more importantly, I hope you'll remember this feeling the next time you're tempted to make judgments based on appearances rather than evidence." The sound of additional vehicles approaching could be heard in the distance, suggesting that the day's activities were about to expand even further. Sarah checked her communications equipment one final time before looking back at the assembled SEALs. "Gentlemen," she said, "your real test is about to begin." The urban training facility that materialized around them over the next hour was unlike anything the SEALs had experienced before. What had been empty concrete structures that morning was now a fully populated simulation of a Middle Eastern city, complete with civilian actors, functioning vehicles, and the constant background noise of urban life. The transformation was so complete that it felt less like a training exercise and more like being transported to an actual conflict zone. Sarah moved through the preparation area with the confidence of someone who had designed every aspect of what they were about to experience. She carried a modified tactical tablet that displayed multiple data streams simultaneously, monitoring everything from weather conditions to the physiological stress levels of the participants. Her earlier gentleness remained, but it was now clearly the professional courtesy of someone who held the power to significantly impact the careers of everyone present. Morrison found himself watching Sarah's movements with a mixture of professional admiration and personal mortification. Every action she took demonstrated expertise that went far beyond anything he had imagined possible. She wasn't just observing the exercise. She was orchestrating it with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. The realization that he had tried to dismiss someone of her caliber as unqualified civilian personnel was becoming more embarrassing with each passing moment. "All right, listen up," called Major Williams, the SEAL team's commanding officer, who had arrived with a convoy of additional vehicles. His presence added another layer of gravity to the situation, making it clear that this evaluation had attracted attention at the highest levels of their command structure. Today's scenario has been designated as a Level 5 tactical assessment, which means your performance will be reviewed by Naval Special Warfare Command and potentially influence unit deployment decisions. The SEALs exchanged glances that mixed excitement with apprehension. Level 5 assessments were rare, typically reserved for units being considered for specialized missions or advanced training opportunities. The fact that their routine training exercise had been upgraded to this level suggested that someone in command was taking an unusual interest in their capabilities. "Your mission parameters are as follows," Major Williams continued, consulting a briefing document that Sarah had provided. "Intelligence indicates that a high-value target designated as Blackbird is coordinating insurgent activities from somewhere within the urban sector. Your objective is to locate, identify, and neutralize Blackbird while minimizing civilian casualties and maintaining operational security." Thompson raised his hand. "Sir, what's our intelligence on Blackbird's profile?" Major Williams looked to Sarah, who stepped forward to take over the briefing. "Blackbird is described as a male, approximately 35 to 40 years old, with extensive combat experience and known connections to international weapons trafficking networks." She displayed a photograph on her tablet showing a bearded man in military-style clothing. However, intelligence also suggests that Blackbird has been using multiple disguises and may not match this physical description when encountered. Rodriguez frowned as he studied the photograph. "Ma'am, that's pretty vague identification criteria. In an urban environment with multiple civilians, how are we supposed to make a positive identification?" Sarah's expression suggested this question was exactly what she had been hoping to hear. "That's an excellent question, and one that highlights the primary challenge of this scenario. You'll need to use tactical intelligence gathering, behavioral analysis, and adaptive thinking rather than relying solely on physical appearance." She gestured toward the simulated urban environment, where civilian actors were already moving through streets and buildings with convincing naturalness. "The enemy forces in this exercise have been specifically instructed to challenge your assumptions about threat identification. Blackbird may not look like the photograph, may not be where you expect to find him, and may not behave according to standard enemy protocols." Morrison was beginning to understand that this scenario had been designed to test exactly the kind of flexibility he had failed to demonstrate that morning. His insistence on making judgments based on appearances rather than evidence was precisely the mindset that could lead to mission failure in the kind of complex environment they were about to enter. "Your communications will be monitored throughout the operation," Sarah continued, "and you'll be expected to adapt your tactics based on real-time intelligence updates. Some of this intelligence will be accurate, some will be deliberately misleading, and some will be incomplete. Your ability to distinguish between reliable and unreliable information will be a key component of your evaluation." Major Williams added, "You'll also be operating under time pressure. Intelligence suggests that Blackbird is planning to execute a major operation within the next 4 hours, which means you need to locate and neutralize the target before that deadline expires." The combination of unclear identification criteria, unreliable intelligence, time pressure, and civilian presence created exactly the kind of complex tactical environment that separated elite units from ordinary soldiers. This wasn't a scenario where superior firepower or physical conditioning would guarantee success. It required the kind of nuanced thinking and adaptive leadership that could only be developed through extensive experience. Sarah checked her tactical tablet and nodded to Major Williams. "All monitoring systems are active, and the civilian population is in position. The exercise will commence in 15 minutes. As the SEALs began their final equipment checks, Morrison found himself fighting the urge to approach Sarah directly. His behavior that morning had been so far out of line that he wasn't sure how to begin making amends, and he was beginning to understand that this exercise might be as much about testing his ability to learn from mistakes as it was about tactical capabilities. Thompson seemed to be thinking along similar lines. You know, he said quietly to Morrison, maybe we should talk about leadership roles for this operation. I mean, given everything that's happened this morning. Morrison knew what Thompson was suggesting. His aggressive behavior towards Sarah had demonstrated exactly the kind of inflexible thinking that could compromise a mission in the complex environment they were about to enter. The responsible thing to do would be to step back and let someone with better judgment take point on the operation. But Morrison's pride warred with his professional sense. He had been designated as team leader for this exercise, and accepting a reduced role felt like admitting professional failure. On the other hand, his interaction with Sarah had already demonstrated professional failure in ways that could hardly be more obvious. I think, Morrison said slowly, that we need to approach this differently than we would in normal exercise. This isn't about proving what we already know. It's about learning to operate effectively when our assumptions are wrong. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. That's probably the smartest thing anyone said all morning. The question is, how do we translate that insight into tactical decisions once we're in the urban sector? Sarah appeared beside them, moving with a silent efficiency that seemed to be her trademark. Excuse me, gentlemen. I wanted to provide one additional piece of information before you begin. She consulted her tablet briefly before continuing. The civilian population in the exercise includes individuals with various professional backgrounds and skill sets. Not all of them are simply bystanders. Morrison felt his stomach drop as he realized the implication. You're saying some of the civilians might be assets? Or threats? I'm saying that effective intelligence gathering requires you to consider all possibilities rather than making assumptions based on appearance or role designation. Sarah's tone was professional, but Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that this guidance was specifically directed at him. The most valuable intelligence often comes from sources that don't match your expectations. The irony was almost overwhelming. Sarah was essentially telling them to avoid making exactly the kind of assumption he had made about her that morning. The lesson couldn't have been more pointed if she had designed it specifically to highlight his error in judgment. Ma'am, Thompson said carefully, are you saying we should treat every civilian as a potential intelligence source? I'm saying you should approach every interaction with an open mind about what you might learn, Sarah replied. Some of the most successful special operations in history have succeeded because operators were willing to gather intelligence from unexpected sources and adapt their plans based on information that didn't match their initial briefings. Major Williams called the team together for final instructions. Remember, this isn't just about completing the mission. Your observers will be evaluating your decision-making process, your ability to work as a team under pressure, and your capacity to adapt when circumstances change unexpectedly. He looked directly at Morrison as he added, leadership in complex environments requires humility, flexibility, and the ability to recognize when your initial assessment of a situation needs to be revised. These are skills that can only be developed through experience, and today's exercise is designed to provide exactly that kind of experience. Sarah stepped forward with a final piece of equipment, a small communication device that looked different from their standard gear. This is a direct link to the observation team. If you encounter a situation that requires immediate guidance, or if you need to report critical intelligence, use this channel. However, be aware that over-reliance on external guidance will be noted in your evaluation. Morrison accepted the device, noting its weight and the sophistication of its design. Everything about this exercise was several levels above what he had expected, and the technology being deployed suggested that the evaluation was being conducted with resources typically reserved for actual operational missions. One final note, Sarah said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. The enemy forces you'll be facing have been briefed on your probable tactics and approaches. They know how Navy SEALs typically operate, and they've been instructed to exploit any predictable patterns in your behavior. Success will require you to think beyond standard operating procedures. The implication was clear. This wouldn't be a scenario where superior training and equipment guaranteed victory. The enemy had been given information that leveled the playing field, forcing the SEALs to rely on adaptability and creative thinking rather than overwhelming tactical advantage. As the final minutes before the exercise ticked away, Morrison found himself reviewing not just the mission parameters, but the morning's events. His interaction with Sarah had been a perfect example of the kind of rigid thinking that could lead to mission failure. His assumptions had been wrong, his attitude had been counterproductive, and his unwillingness to consider alternative explanations had demonstrated exactly the kind of cognitive inflexibility that the exercise was designed to identify and correct. The question now was whether he could apply the lessons of that interaction to the complex tactical environment they were about to enter. Success would require not just admitting that his initial assumptions had been wrong, but developing the mental flexibility to continuously question and revise his understanding as new information became available. Time, Major Williams announced. Exercise begins now. Good luck, gentlemen. As the team moved toward the urban sector, Morrison caught sight of Sarah settling into the observation post with her array of monitoring equipment. The woman he had dismissed as unqualified civilian personnel that morning was now in a position to significantly influence his career based on his performance over the next several hours. The exercise had begun, but Morrison was beginning to understand that the real test had started the moment he had first opened his mouth that morning. The urban sector was a masterpiece of tactical simulation that challenged every assumption Morrison had ever made about training exercises. The streets buzzed with authentic civilian activity. Vendors selling food from makeshift stalls, children playing in doorways, elderly men gathered around checkerboard tables, and women carrying packages between shops. The level of detail was so convincing that it took conscious effort to remember this was an artificial environment. Morrison led his team through the initial approach, trying to apply the lessons from his morning encounter with Sarah. Instead of making immediate judgments about the people they encountered, he forced himself to observe and analyze before drawing conclusions. The effort was more mentally exhausting than he had expected, requiring him to fight against years of tactical training that emphasized rapid threat assessment and decisive action. "Contact front," Rodriguez whispered into his radio, indicating a group of men gathered around a vehicle at the end of the street. 3 males, apparent military age. One appears to be carrying concealed weapon. Morrison studied the group through his scope, noting their positions and behavior patterns. Under normal circumstances, he would have classified them as potential threats and planned accordingly. But Sarah's words about avoiding assumptions echoed in his mind, forcing him to consider alternative explanations for what he was observing. "Hold position," he commanded. "Thompson, can you get a better angle on their activity?" Thompson maneuvered to an elevated position and reported back. "They're working on engine repairs. The concealed object appears to be a toolbox, not a weapon. Civilian mechanics, not enemy combatants." It was exactly the kind of misidentification that could have led to civilian casualties or blown operational security. Morrison felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment as he realized how close he had come to making another assumption-based error. The exercise was forcing him to slow down his decision-making process in ways that felt unnatural but were proving essential for accurate threat assessment. "Good catch," he told Thompson. "Let's circle around and continue toward the target area." As they moved deeper into the urban sector, the complexity of the scenario became increasingly apparent. Every civilian they encountered presented potential intelligence opportunities, but distinguishing between genuine sources and deliberate distractions required a level of psychological sophistication that went far beyond standard tactical training. An elderly woman selling fruit from a cart made eye contact with Morrison and gestured subtly toward a building across the street. The gesture was so slight that he almost missed it, but something about her timing and positioning suggested it might be significant. Under normal circumstances, he would have dismissed an elderly civilian as irrelevant to military operations. Now, he found himself questioning whether that assumption might be another mistake. Rodriguez, Take position to observe that building, Morrison instructed, indicating the structure the woman had pointed toward. Something about it doesn't feel right. Rodriguez studied the building through his binoculars for several minutes before reporting back. Multiple individuals inside, but their movement patterns are wrong for civilian occupation. They're positioning themselves like they're expecting contact. The intelligence from the elderly fruit vendor was proving accurate, challenging Morrison's preconceptions about who could serve as a reliable source in a complex environment. The realization that he had almost ignored potentially crucial information because of assumptions about age and gender was deeply uncomfortable, forcing him to confront how many other opportunities he might have missed in previous operations. New plan, Morrison announced. We treat every civilian as a potential intelligence asset until proven otherwise. That means active observation, respectful interaction, and careful analysis of any information they provide. Thompson nodded approvingly. That's going to slow us down significantly, but it's probably the only way to operate effectively in an environment this complex. The truth of Thompson's observation became apparent as they continued their approach toward the target area. What would normally have been a straightforward movement became a complex intelligence-gathering operation that required constant evaluation of new information from unexpected sources. A child playing in an alley provided accurate information about enemy patrol patterns. A shopkeeper offered detailed observations about suspicious activities in nearby buildings. An apparent beggar turned out to have comprehensive knowledge of the local area's tactical significance. Each interaction forced Morrison to question his fundamental assumptions about intelligence sources and tactical decision-making. The exercise was revealing how much his previous success had depended on operating in environments where enemy forces followed predictable patterns and civilian populations were largely irrelevant to mission objectives. Morrison, this is observation, came Sarah's voice through his special communications device. Your adaptation to alternative intelligence sources has been noted. However, be aware that your target timeline is now compressed due to developing tactical situation. Morrison checked his watch and felt a spike of stress. They had been moving so carefully that they were falling behind schedule, but the intelligence they were gathering was proving too valuable to ignore. The tension between thorough preparation and time pressure was forcing him to make the kind of difficult prioritization decisions that separated competent leaders from truly effective ones. Team, we need to accelerate our timeline without compromising intelligence gathering, he announced. Rodriguez, I want you to establish overwatch on the primary target building. Thompson, continue working civilian sources, but focus on immediate tactical intelligence. We need to confirm Blackbird's location within the next 30 minutes. The target building was a 3-story structure that had been identified as Blackbird's probable command center, but the intelligence they had gathered from civilian sources suggested the situation was more complex than their initial briefing had indicated. Multiple individuals matching aspects of Blackbird's description had been observed in the area, and their movement patterns suggested a level of operational sophistication that went beyond typical enemy capabilities. Something's not right about this, Rodriguez reported from his overwatch position. I've got multiple individuals who could match the target profile, but they're operating with a level of coordination that suggests extensive training and preparation. Morrison found himself facing exactly the kind of complex tactical decision that the exercise was designed to test. The intelligence picture was incomplete and potentially contradictory. The time pressure was increasing, and the enemy forces were demonstrating capabilities that exceeded their initial estimates. Thompson, what are you getting from local sources? Conflicting information, Thompson replied. Some civilians report Blackbird as a single individual operating alone. Others describe a coordinated group with multiple leaders. A few suggest that Blackbird isn't a person at all, but a code name for a larger organizational structure. The possibility that their entire mission premise might be fundamentally flawed was exactly the kind of adaptive challenge that Sarah had warned them to expect. Morrison realized that succeeding in this environment would require not just flexibility about tactical approaches, but willingness to completely reconceptualize their understanding of the mission itself. Observation, This is team leader. Morrison spoke into the special communications device, requesting guidance on target identification criteria. Current intelligence suggests mission parameters may need revision. Sarah's response came back immediately. Team leader, your ability to recognize when fundamental assumptions require revision is being evaluated. Use your best judgment based on available intelligence, but be prepared to justify your decision-making process during post-exercise analysis. The response was simultaneously helpful and challenging. Sarah was confirming that questioning the mission parameters was appropriate, but she was also making it clear that Morrison would be held accountable for whatever decisions he made based on that questioning. All right, team, listen up, Morrison announced. We're going to proceed on the assumption that Blackbird represents a more complex threat than initially briefed. Rodriguez, I want continuous observation of all potential targets. Thompson, keep gathering intelligence, but prepare for the possibility that we're dealing with multiple coordinated threats rather than a single individual. As they approached the target building, the level of tactical complexity continued to escalate. Enemy forces were demonstrating awareness of SEAL operational patterns, positioning themselves to counter anticipated approaches, and using civilian areas as cover in ways that made standard assault techniques problematic. They're not just prepared for us, Rodriguez observed. They're specifically prepared for how Navy SEALs operate. Someone briefed them on our typical tactics, and they've designed their defensive positions accordingly. Morrison felt a chill of recognition. This was exactly what Sarah had warned them about, an enemy force that had been given intelligence about SEAL operational methods and instructed to exploit predictable patterns. Success would require them to operate outside their standard procedures in ways that felt uncomfortable and unfamiliar. New approach, Morrison decided. We're going to assume that everything we would normally do is expected and planned for. Thompson, I want you to take point on this assault, but use approaches that contradict standard SEAL tactics. Rodriguez, provide support, but be prepared for enemy positions that anticipate our typical Overwatch protocols. The decision to operate against their own training felt counterintuitive and dangerous, but the intelligence they had gathered made it clear that conventional approaches would likely result in mission failure. Morrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to innovate tactical solutions in real time, while under direct observation from evaluators who would judge every decision he made. As they began their final approach toward the target building, Morrison caught sight of Sarah in the observation post. Even from a distance, he could see that she was monitoring multiple data streams simultaneously, tracking not just their physical movements, but their communications, decision-making processes, and adaptation to unexpected challenges. The woman he had dismissed as unqualified civilian personnel that morning was now evaluating his performance in one of the most complex tactical scenarios he had ever encountered. The irony was inescapable. His ability to recognize and correct his assumptions about her was now being tested in an environment designed to challenge every assumption he made about enemy capabilities, civilian populations, and mission objectives. Contact imminent, Rodriguez reported from his position. Multiple targets confirmed, defensive positions established, civilian presence complicating engagement parameters. Morrison took a deep breath and prepared to make decisions that would determine not just the success of the exercise, but the trajectory of his career. The morning's lesson about the dangers of assumption-based thinking was about to be tested under the kind of pressure that revealed whether someone had truly learned from their mistakes or simply acknowledged them intellectually. Execute, Morrison commanded, knowing that the next few minutes would demonstrate whether he had developed the kind of adaptive thinking that Sarah had been trying to teach him since the moment they first met. The assault on the target building unfolded in ways that challenged every tactical assumption Morrison had ever held. As his team approached using unconventional routes and timing, they discovered that the enemy forces had prepared for standard SEAL tactics, but were unprepared for the adaptive approaches Morrison had implemented based on his morning lesson with Sarah. Thompson's non-standard entry point caught the defenders off guard, while Rodriguez's unorthodox Overwatch position provided intelligence that revealed the true complexity of the situation. Instead of finding a single high-value target, they discovered a sophisticated command structure where multiple individuals were sharing leadership responsibilities in ways that made traditional target identification protocols ineffective. Multiple potential blackbirds confirmed, Thompson reported as they secured the building floor by floor. But none of them matched the original intelligence profile exactly. We got a female coordinator, an elderly male strategist, and a young technical specialist. All three appear to be sharing command responsibilities. Morrison found himself facing exactly the kind of complex decision that the exercise had been designed to test. The mission parameters called for neutralizing Blackbird, but their discoveries suggested that Blackbird wasn't a single person, but rather a distributed leadership structure. Conventional thinking would have forced him to choose one target and hope it was correct, but his morning encounter with Sarah had taught him the importance of questioning fundamental assumptions. Observation: this is team leader. Morrison spoke into his communications device. Target identification complete, but mission parameters require revision. Blackbird appears to be an organizational structure rather than an individual. Requesting guidance on neutralization protocols. Sarah's response came back with the crisp authority of someone who had been expecting exactly this development. Team leader, your analysis is correct. Proceed with neutralization of all command elements. This represents successful adaptation to intelligence that contradicted initial briefing assumptions. The confirmation that their revised understanding was correct provided a surge of confidence that Morrison hadn't expected. His willingness to question the mission's fundamental premise, rather than forcing the situation to match his expectations, had led to accurate threat assessment and appropriate tactical adaptation. As they completed the neutralization of the distributed command structure, Morrison began to understand that the exercise had been as much about psychological development as tactical skills. Every challenge they had faced, from unreliable initial intelligence to unconventional enemy tactics, had been designed to test their ability to operate effectively when their assumptions proved incorrect. All targets neutralized, Rodriguez reported as they completed their sweep of the building. No civilian casualties, operational security maintained throughout. But even as they celebrated the successful completion of the primary mission, Morrison realized that the true test had been his own psychological development throughout the day. His morning interaction with Sarah had forced him to confront the dangers of assumption-based thinking, and the exercise had provided multiple opportunities to apply that lesson under increasing pressure. Excellent work, team, came Major Williams' voice over their communications. Return to base for debriefing and evaluation review. As they moved back through the urban sector, Morrison found himself noticing details that had escaped his attention during the initial approach. The elderly fruit vendor who had provided crucial intelligence was now gone, her cart replaced by a different vendor who watched their passage with professional interest. The apparent civilians who had offered tactical information were moving through the area with the kind of situational awareness that suggested extensive training. The entire exercise had been populated not with random actors playing civilian roles, but with intelligence professionals and tactical specialists who had been evaluating the SEAL's ability to gather information from unexpected sources. Morrison's initial assumption that civilians were irrelevant to military operations had been systematically challenged by encounters with individuals whose expertise exceeded his own in specialized areas. When they reached the debriefing area, Sarah was waiting with a comprehensive analysis displayed on multiple screens. Her evaluation covered not just their tactical performance, but their psychological adaptation to changing circumstances, their ability to gather intelligence from unconventional sources, and their willingness to revise fundamental assumptions when evidence contradicted their initial briefing. Overall assessment, Sarah began, demonstrates significant improvement in adaptive thinking capabilities, with particular strength in recognizing when initial intelligence requires revision. She looked directly at Morrison as she added, leadership performance showed marked evolution throughout the exercise, with early rigidity giving way to increasing flexibility and responsiveness to new information. Major Williams nodded approvingly as he reviewed the detailed performance metrics. Morrison, your ability to question mission parameters when evidence suggested they were incomplete shows exactly the kind of intellectual courage we need in complex operational environments. But Sarah wasn't finished with her evaluation. However, she continued, the most significant learning opportunity occurred before the exercise began. The interaction between team leadership and support personnel revealed assumptions and communication patterns that could have compromised mission effectiveness if not addressed. Morrison felt his face flush as he realized Sarah was discussing his behavior from that morning in front of Major Williams and the entire evaluation team. His dismissive treatment of her, his assumptions about her qualifications, and his aggressive insistence on his own authority were all being reviewed as part of his professional assessment. The initial assumption that civilian dress personnel were unqualified for technical work demonstrated exactly the kind of cognitive rigidity that can lead to mission failure, Sarah continued. More importantly, the unwillingness to consider alternative explanations for observed competence showed a pattern of thinking that would be problematic in environments where intelligence comes from unexpected sources. Major Williams looked from Sarah to Morrison with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand the full scope of what had occurred that morning. Morrison, do you want to address the evaluation team's concerns about your initial behavior? Morrison took a deep breath, recognizing that this moment would define not just his evaluation, but his professional development going forward. Sir, my behavior this morning was completely inappropriate and demonstrated exactly the kind of assumption-based thinking that compromises operational effectiveness. I made judgments about qualifications based on appearance rather than evidence, and I responded to being corrected with defensiveness rather than intellectual curiosity. He looked directly at Sarah as he continued. More importantly, I failed to recognize that my assumptions about someone's role and capabilities could be completely wrong, even when evidence was right in front of me. In a real operational environment, that kind of thinking could get people killed. Sarah's expression softened slightly, showing a hint of the patience and professionalism she had demonstrated throughout their interaction. The ability to recognize and admit cognitive errors is essential for operational success, she said. But more important is developing the mental flexibility to avoid making those errors in the first place. Major Williams consulted the evaluation reports before speaking. Morrison, your tactical performance during the exercise was excellent, and your ability to adapt when assumptions proved incorrect was exactly what we're looking for in senior leadership positions. However, your initial behavior towards support personnel raises questions about your readiness for advanced responsibilities. Morrison felt his stomach drop as he realized the full career implications of his morning mistakes. But Sarah stepped forward before Major Williams could continue. Sir, if I may, she said, Morrison's evolution throughout the day demonstrates exactly the kind of learning capacity that makes someone suitable for complex operational roles. His initial errors were significant, but his ability to recognize them, learn from them, and apply those lessons under pressure suggests strong potential for continued development. She pulled up additional performance data on her screens. The psychological flexibility he demonstrated during the exercise, his willingness to question fundamental mission assumptions, and his ability to adapt his leadership style based on changing circumstances all indicate that his morning errors were learning opportunities rather than fundamental character flaws. Morrison looked at Sarah with something approaching amazement. After the way he had treated her that morning, she was now advocating for his professional advancement. Her recommendation carried significant weight given her qualifications and the sophistication of the evaluation she had conducted. Additionally, Sarah continued, his team's performance throughout the exercise was exceptional precisely because he learned to value input from unexpected sources and question his own assumptions. Those are exactly the skills we need to develop in personnel who will be operating in complex environments where conventional thinking is insufficient. Major Williams reviewed the complete evaluation before making his decision. Morrison, you're being recommended for advanced leadership training, contingent on continued development of the adaptive thinking skills you demonstrated during this exercise. He looked stern as he added, but this recommendation comes with the expectation that you'll remember the lessons from this morning about the importance of treating all personnel with respect regardless of their apparent role or status. As the formal debriefing concluded and the other personnel began packing up their equipment, Morrison approached Sarah directly. The sophisticated monitoring systems were being disassembled around them, and the urban training sector was gradually returning to its empty concrete appearance. "Ma'am," Morrison said quietly, "I need to thank you for your recommendation, but more importantly, I need to thank you for the lesson you taught me this morning. I'm embarrassed by how I behaved, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to learn from it." Sarah smiled with genuine warmth for the first time since they had met. The best leaders are the ones who can recognize when they're wrong and use that recognition to become better. Your performance today suggests you have that capacity. She packed the last of her equipment into the gear bag she had carried since early morning, the same bag Morrison had dismissed as civilian contractor equipment. "Remember this feeling," she said. "The next time you're tempted to make assumptions about someone's capabilities based on their appearance or role, remember how wrong those assumptions can be." As Sarah walked toward the helicopters that would return her to whatever classified assignment awaited her next, Morrison watched with a mixture of professional admiration and personal humility. The woman he had tried to dismiss as unqualified civilian personnel was disappearing into operational responsibilities that he could only imagine. Thompson appeared beside him, also watching Sarah's departure. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I'm starting to think this whole exercise was designed around that one lesson. Everything else was just providing opportunities to practice what she taught you this morning." Morrison nodded slowly, understanding that his teammate was probably correct. The sophisticated tactical scenario, the distributed command structure, the unreliable intelligence, and the need to gather information from unexpected sources had all been designed to reinforce a single crucial lesson about the dangers of assumption-based thinking. As the helicopters lifted off and disappeared into the afternoon sky, Morrison found himself changed in ways that went far beyond tactical skills or professional development. He had learned that true strength often came disguised as gentleness, that real expertise didn't need to announce itself, and that the most important battles were often won by people who never raised their voices or demanded recognition. The morning's encounter had taught him that respect wasn't something to be demanded based on rank or role, but something to be earned through competence and character. More importantly, he had learned that assuming someone was staying in their lane might blind him to the possibility that their lane was far wider and more sophisticated than he could imagine. The training exercise was over, but Morrison suspected that the real education had just begun.